My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. I blog at creativitydiscourse.com, do mythologically inspired movie reviews at cinemadiscourse.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. Today we're going to talk about traditional Japanese architecture, and we're going to try to look at the mythic structure of Japanese culture that underlies this architecture. So when I say mythic structure, here are 5 Eurasian cultures, and each of them has a different, shall we say, psychology, the way a person would have a psychological character. In the going from left to right, in the West, or Europe, shared with the United States, there's a focus on the individual and an inner moral compass in each individual. And we might associate this with the Percival myths of the Arthurian romances, and I have a Michelangelo David representing the notion of a human being in this culture. Next is Greece, also a focus on the individual here, subject to fate, and the mythological figure that might represent this is Prometheus, and below that is a Greek sculpture. In the Middle East, an emphasis on the society rather than the individual, and this notion as above so below, meaning that we should put ourselves in accord with the principles of the universe as revealed by the stars and of the Creator as revealed by His Word. And we might take our mythological figure as Job from the Bible, and here we have a Mesopotamian priest in supplication, indicative of this culture. In India, an identification with the infinite represented by the Buddha. This world is ephemeral, not real, and we are mistaken to be attached to it, and a way to escape that attachment is indicated in the teaching of the Buddha. Finally, on the far right, I'm lumping China and Japan together for this very brief mythological overview. And in the East is a notion that we should experience ourselves as part of the flow of nature. And there's a mythological figure, a monkey, who's very rambunctious, but is ultimately subjugated to the principles of the culture we might take as our symbolic form. Now, notice in all the others we have a sort of human being. We have a Buddha, a Paramita for India, but who is actually an Indonesian figure. But on the right, we have a landscape, and there are people in there if we were to look really close. But the point is they're integral with the landscape, a part of it, and not metaphysically separated out from it. And that's what we're going to see when we look at Japanese architecture. A Japanese painting from the early 19th century, and look at how integral the architecture is with nature and the people as well. And there are people there. It might just take us a moment to spot them. And let's compare that with an archetypal Western painting, very famous, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. And this is a real exaggeration, but look at how she dominates the landscape. The landscape is miniaturized in back of her, and the human figure takes up most of the painting, is central to it, and dominant over the landscape, as opposed to what we see on the left, where people and architecture are integrated into the landscape. So, influences on Japanese architecture. Geography and climate. forested volcanic islands subject to hurricanes and earthquakes, and rich in wood and bamboo. Philosophy and religion, and we'll look at Shintoism and Zen Buddhism, and there's a veneration of nature, and we'll see that in this architecture. Social structure, formality and convention versus spontaneity. There's always a tension about that in Japanese culture. And then outside influences, particularly from China, in lots of ways, including in terms of planning and building principles. On a map, it's a string of islands, quite long from north to south, and if we project that over, it's pretty much, not totally, but somewhat parallel with the United States. And so we see in Japan the variation in climate from north to south that we also see in the United States. Quite a large range of variation. The architectural characteristics: use of wood and bamboo, which we just said was abundant. Modularity, resulting from the use of timber, and we're going to see the tatami mats, the shoji screens that provide modular building units from which the traditional Japanese house is arranged. A play of formality and spontaneity, very fine woodworking, and a tendency toward miniaturization, as we see in gardens, flower arrangements, bonsai trees, perhaps related to the fact that this large population on these small islands. Now, in Asian building construction, true in China and Japan, we have the following characteristics: a podium of rammed earth, wood columns on stone bases, non-structural walls, a wood roof supporting system, and a tiled roof. So, our rammed earth podium, which we see here, and then in a section we see it down here. So the earth is taken and pounded to make a base. We don't go down for footings, what we do in the West. Then you do not want to put a wood post on the earth because it'll act like a straw and just suck up moisture and rot. So we have a stone here, see that here, and can sort of see it here and just barely here. Then our columns, and then infill non-structural walls. Now, interestingly, this structure supporting column and the infill non-bearing non-structural wall is going to be something borrowed by modern architecture, and then sometimes quite elaborate wood roof systems, and then tile or sometimes thatched roofs. So on the upper right, we see a western roof, which is a truss. So we do not have to rely on the beam to make this span across, but rather this whole thing is triangulated and acts as a truss. We do not have these trusses in Japan, and we have to make the span, and then we make subspans in order to support the roof at the at intermediate points. And we have systems of bracketing to reduce the span that the beam has to make, and then we can have we can break down our span so that the roof itself makes shorter and shorter distances that the structure has to cover. A notion of space totally different from ours in the West, and it almost cannot be described. Japanese, when you ask them about their notion of space, and of course we might start with a Newtonian notion of space as absolute uniform. Imagine a vast imaginary grid and marking out a potential which can be occupied by objects. That's a Newtonian space. When we get to Einstein, we have the object itself generating a dynamic space. In Japan, they'll say something about an onion. That there's somehow this layered experience, totally different from ours and not translatable into the terms we use. We're looking at the interior of a traditional Japanese house here, giving us this feeling. And then a very strong integration of inside and outside. So our non-bearing partition walls are often sliding soji screens, which are made out of paper. So we have a light wood framework and then rice paper stretched across that, and they can slide out of the way and very richly integrate inside and outside. So this kind of division between inside and outside, either or, that's more characteristic of our thinking is not found in Japan. This modularity we mentioned is measured by the tatami mat. So tatami mat is roughly 3 feet by 6 feet, and you can have a half sometimes. And the one would say to a traditional client would say to a traditional Japanese architect how big they want the room. They want a 9-mat room, for example, or some number like that, and that will indicate the size of the room rather than drawing it the way we would. And in traditional Japanese architecture, okay, you have a climate that parallels ours in the United States, and it can get cold, and we have paper walls. So how do you heat the house? And the answer is you don't heat the house. So here we have a cooking area. You move the tatami mats aside, and you have a bed of burning wood down to embers, and we hang our pots over that to do our cooking. When it's done, tamp down the embers. You got to be real careful here. You don't burn the house down. And put the mats back and sleep on them. That keeps you warm. And then the clothes, you throw your clothes over that heated area, and the heat goes up underneath the clothes so that you heat just the self rather than the whole space. And then this is a tokonoma, which is an alcove off of a living room. And it's a sort of a shrine, not a religious shrine, but just a shrine for that which we respect, flowers that are arranged, maybe just a beautiful tree branch. Now, notice here that the column in the middle is quite rough and irregular. That is totally deliberate. So, where in the West, we might get a big, preferably very straight, tree trunk, and then run it through a saw so that we've now made comparable to this 4x4 or 6x6 beam. And here we take a carefully selected tree with just the right camber in it, just the right irregularity. Maybe leave bark on, maybe peel it all off, and then no varnish, no lacquer, because we want the spirit in the wood to be able to radiate into the room. So we venerate the natural, and it radiates into the space and enriches us. Now, traditional Japanese architecture does not involve nails. So we would make our wall with 2x4s and a footer piece, a sill piece, and then every 18 inches, a 2x4, nail it all in, tilt the wall up, and we just knock the nails in there. Japanese traditionally do not use nails, but do elaborate carved joinery. So we make these joints that lock together, and this becomes a form of decoration or ornament. And so we're exaggerating these joints for the ornamental value. These are some of those brackets that we saw earlier, and those are also exaggerated for ornamental value. On the right, we have Japanese food that has been elaborately attacked by a chef's knife, and we see this attention to detail, this sense of beauty, this sense of perfection and veneration for materials. Now we're going to look at Shintoism and then Zen Buddhism. And Shintoism is the ethnic religion of Japan. It is nature-based with roots in prehistoric shamanism and goddess worship. It's fundamentally an ancestor religion. It's a veneration of the kami or spirit of places, of ancestors, etc. And there are several mythological figures that are fundamental to it. Now, to sort of position Shintoism, we can say there are two types of religion. There are ethnic religions and world religions. An ethnic religion is for a particular ethnic group: Judaism, Hinduism, Shintoism. You do not typically convert to these religions. They aren't for everybody. You are Shinto by being born Japanese. It's not a choice, it's what you are. And this contrasts with world religions, which are or can be for everybody. So while a world religion originates in one place, it is now world. And the major world religions are Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. And in each case, they originated somewhere, but we may not even think about where it originated. We now think of it, identify with it in whatever part of the world it now is. Now, in Shintoism, there's a veneration for special places. There's a feeling that there's a power in this place. Of course, the most important place is Japan itself. It's sort of the mother that one is rooted in. But if there's a particularly important place, when you see a tree and you say, wow, that tree has a lot of spiritual power, you mark it here with a rope and then put a little fence around it to protect it. And this now becomes a little shrine. On the right, we sort of see there's a monster tree back there, and we've gone further than just a rope, although we still do have the rope, and we've added a little shrine. And the shrine is sort of protective for offerings that you might make to the spirits of the place. Here is a rock that someone deemed to be very powerful, and there's huge ropes around it to mark it. And then, again, a little shrine. One might come up to this somewhat remote spot, bit of effort involved, so one can rest and meditate in this little shrine, which is also a place for offerings. Now, there's one major shrine in Shintoism, and that's Ise Shrine. And it was first built around the 3rd century of the Common Era, and for those of us who are older, that's 3rd century AD. And it is rebuilt periodically. Well, I'll just say it now. I'll get to it in a minute. It is rebuilt every 20 years. It's the Imperial Ancestral Shrine. It has 2 temples, the Nyoku and the Gekku. And the Nyoku is dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu and is symbolic of a granary, and it holds the imperial paraphernalia. If it was in England, you would say the crown jewels. There's a jewel, a mirror, and a sword. It's symbolic of the imperial rulers. And it is again reconstructed every 20 years. And before we get to that, let's compare it to a major, shall we say, European shrine. Here's Chartres Cathedral, and let's look at the differences. First of all, Chartres Cathedral is a lot bigger, so I made the picture bigger. But let's go on beyond that. Chartres Cathedral is in stone. It is striving toward permanence. And it's so far, it's almost 1,000 years. And EC Shrine, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. There's no effort toward permanence. It's even deliberately built in wood, which will decay. And a contrast between the two notions of existence. And so, despite the spirituality of Christian Europe, there's also an attempt to hold on to one's place in this world, to value one's life in its materiality and duration. In the East, including Japan, we have the notion of reincarnation, so that there's no need to hold on to this life because all life is continually dying and being reborn. It's all an ongoing process. Now, here we see these, on the right, two ancient forms of Japanese houses. The upper one is a pit house, and so dug down, get some thermal stability, cooling in the summer and a little bit more warmth in the winter. And the lower one is a house up on stilts, and those are used in swampy areas and even built into lakes among those who fished. And it's also the form of a granary. And of course, granaries where you store the harvested grain, in this culture rice, we want them off the ground to so that the rice doesn't get damp and rot, and to have some degree of protection from vermin. And we see how that is, this early house and this granary are symbolized in the EC Shrine. As I said, it's rebuilt every 20 years. It's quite an elaborate ceremony. And so we see in this aerial view, the upper one to the right is coming to the end of its 20-year life. And we have moss growing into the thatched roof. We see the wood is getting darker browns, decaying, and we're building a fresh new one to the lower left. It's located in a forest that provides the trees for this rebuilding, and there are carpenters who it is their life's work to do this, and it's a very sacred activity. Here's another view of an older and newer version. And then the old version, in this case the one above, will be torn down, and 20 years later the one below will be the old one, and the new one will be built in the lot above. Here's a view of it. We have this beautifully trimmed thatch for the roof, and then these kind of barrel-like forms going across the roof. Those are heavy pieces of log that are weights to just hold down the roof. And here again they are exaggerated to become decorative, and they are covered with gold leaf in this case. Here we see the plan where we come into it, and it is built without nails through this process of joinery. These long round dowels we see are pegs to tie together wood, and they don't have to be that long. These are now taking advantage of this detail to make it decorative, so that the detailing becomes decorative. Okay, now one of the things about Japan is, a story that when MacArthur began his leadership of the occupation of Japan, the American occupation after World War II, first thing you do when you occupy somebody is you do a census. You've got to know who's here. And they asked who's a Buddhist, who's a Christian, who's a Shinto, and they came up with a number far in excess of the population, because you can be all three and more. So typically you're Shinto at birth, and the birth ceremonies are Shinto, welcoming you into the larger family of Japan. You might be, as a girl, you might be a Christian as you get older, and you are looking for modesty, and when you come near death you might be a Buddhist in preparation for what is coming next. There are several forms of Buddhism in Japan, and we'll just look very briefly at one of them, Zen Buddhism. Now, Tibetan Buddhism has very strong parallels with Catholicism in terms of its elaborate church hierarchy and in terms of its rich theology. There's massive amounts of written theology and philosophy in Tibetan Buddhism. We don't have that in Zen Buddhism. There isn't any writing. In Zen Buddhism, you do sitting meditation. And so you sit and you meditate all day, and occasionally the meditation master comes by and swats you with a 2x4. He's figured out that's what you need at that moment. And then you'll be asked a koan periodically, very famously. What's the famous one? Right. What is the sound of one hand clapping? And you try to figure it out. Well, that won't work, because the idea is to directly experience reality as it is, as opposed to understand or have theories about reality. So the point of Zen Buddhism is this direct experience which comes through meditation. It originates, well, Japan gets it from China, where it's Chenan Buddhism. It was a reform movement in response to other movements that have become very elaborated. And its simple, disciplined ways appealed to military rulers and their warrior aristocracies, the samurai. So samurai warriors are typically Zen Buddhists. Now there's a whole question, how can you be a Zen Buddhist and kill people? Since Buddhism is pacifist. Well, that's a whole other discussion, but typically samurais are Buddhists. And Zen Buddhism assimilated the Taoism from Japan, which involves a veneration for nature, and a lot of Shintoism, which also has this veneration for nature. And Zen encourages simplicity, humility, asymmetry, spontaneity, subdued natural materials. Think of the difference between the dishes and cups in a Chinese restaurant and a Japanese restaurant. In a Chinese restaurant, they will be glazed with a rich pattern. In the Japanese restaurant, they will be very typically left very plain. There's a contemplation of nature, an appreciation of the moment, and an interest in the essence of things. Now, the essence of things, as in, when in construction, what is the essence of wood, and how can we let it express that essence? And this is going to become, we'll see a little bit later, very inspirational to Western modern architects. Now, here is a Zen artist, calligrapher, preparing an elaborate design. On the right is a very famous one, and tell a little bit of a Zen story. A client goes to a Zen calligraphy master and wants for a special event a ceremonial calligraphy. And they agree roughly what it's going to be, and the client says, well, I do have plenty of time. When can I get it? And the Zen master says, in 1 month. And the client's a little bit nervous now because it's going to cut it close. He says, okay, 1 month, be Thursday, 12 noon. Okay. After 2 weeks, he comes by, how's it going? Oh, everything's fine. It's coming along. The client doesn't see anything. After 3 weeks, comes by, how's it going? Oh, it's coming fine. There's nothing, nothing there though. The day before, comes by again. Are we okay? Everything's fine. Doesn't see anything, but he doesn't dare say anything. And so it's due Thursday at noon. Thursday comes at 11. There's nothing there. Zen master says, you go sit down over there. He sits down, and 1 minute before noon, he mixes his inks and dips his brush in and zip, 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 zip. There's the piece. It's, okay, all done. Client says, well, what was the month for? And he says, well, it was meditation preparation. So, our architectural example for Zen approach to architecture in Japan is Katsura Imperial Villa. Now, there's a whole story here. There was the emperor did not have any male offspring, and he adopted a son who was then prepared to take over, and then the emperor did have a male offspring. So now here's this young man who's been prepared to be emperor, and there's there's no assistant emperor jobs or something like that. So what's he going to do? So they build him a villa where he can be a poet. He's going to read poetry, write poetry, contemplate nature. That's what he's been prepared to do. And that's what Katsura Imperial Villa is. And we see on the right, it's, what's the word? Asymmetrical, very irregular. And we see a grid of columns, all wood columns. We can see them in the picture on the left. And then there are these infill walls, many of which are sliding, and they can appear here and appear there. And then we see these tiny little dotted lines. Those are outlining our tatami mats, showing us how big each room is. So that's Katsura Imperial Villa. And now let's contrast it with another villa. So this is Villa Rotonda on the right by Andrea Palladio in the late 1500s. Also for a retired, in this case, clergyman, and this is his weekend entertaining place. He's going to read there. He's going to entertain there. Look at the contrast in the difference of these. On the left in Katsura, it meanders. There's a breakdown in the boundaries between inside and outside. The spaces inside filter one into another. The spaces, the inside and the outside, interpenetrate each other. On the right, there's a very clear, distinct square that defines the boundaries between inside and outside. And then there's this round circle and plan. It's a dome where the human being stands. And from that central reference point, you can survey out and dominate the landscape through your senses. And here, in an aerial view, we see that Katsura is integrated with, mingles with, is intertwined with its environment, which is going to, again, interpenetrate with it. On the right, Villa Rotunda stands on a hill and dominates its landscape, positions the human being separate and distinct from nature to survey and be dominant over nature. Whereas on the left, the human being is a part of nature. We are not metaphysically separate and different from nature, but just one more part of it. So here are some scenes of Katsura and its beautiful landscape. Now, one of the things about this landscape, it looks natural, random, totally human-made to look natural. And so, you know, there are no accidents in Japanese art. It's all very deliberate. Here's a panoramic view. More views. And it's designed to be sensitive to the changing of the seasons, the different qualities of the leaves in the different seasons. And here, see this pathway coming up to the building? Well, here are the features we mentioned before. Let's see. Here is our rammed earth podium. Here's the stone set on there. It's going to keep the moisture from getting into the wood. Here's our wood column. And here is our non-bearing wall. And this again is a shoji screen that can slide and open it up. And then we have our elaborate structure for the roof, and in this case shingled roofing, not tile. And now let's take another view looking the other way. And here is our rammed earth podium. At the edge of it is crushed rock. Why is that there? It sort of runs around the border of the window. Notice there's no gutters on the roof. The water's going to run off the roof, come straight down, and chew up the ground. So this edge of stone is to protect the ground. And now a walkway with stones for our path. So we see each of these elements in the ground plan having a very sensitive functional reason. And on the left, again, we see this layering of space. On the right, we see the interpenetration of inside and outside. And here was in the last picture, but now we're looking directly at it. This is the moon contemplation deck. So you sit here and you watch the moon. So it's all very poetic. Here are some haikus from Basho. Haikus are 17-syllable Japanese poetry. A cuckoo cries, and through a thicket of bamboo the late moon shines. And it's tricky getting the translations to come out 17 syllables, but this kind of just the moment in Japanese poetry. It's also what we're capturing in this architecture. Now, Katsura has a tea house, and of course there are tea houses all over Japan, and a tea house is a place for the tea ceremony. Tea ceremony is a ritual in which, as a tourist, you will go to a tea ceremony, and you'll be with a small group, and the tea master will produce tea for you. Now, I make tea every morning. I don't know how hard it is. I throw the tea bag in the hot water, but the act of doing this, the use of the powdered tea, the little whisk that mixes it with the water, preheating the cup with warm water, having everything just the right temperature, the way the cups are made. Remember I said that in a The difference you'll find in the dishware in a Chinese restaurant and a Japanese restaurant. A Chinese teacup would look like our conventional teacup, be glazed and maybe have ornament on it. Maybe there's some peacocks, dragon, something. A Japanese teacup might be a little more solid, kind of thick, and the outside might even have kind of irregular stripes in it from your fingers dragging, or the potter's fingers dragging on the clay as it was made on a potter's wheel. There might have even been grout in the clay, which is so little chunks, and so those chunks will sort of scratch it so that the process of how it was made is communicated to you and you can feel it in your hand. It might not be glazed on the outside so that you can feel the natural clay, and just glazed on the inside so that the tea won't seep into the clay. And so how the teacup was made, the wood of the tea house, how the tea house was made, the ceremony between the guest and the tea master, all of this is a ritual that communicates to you the entire nature and structure of Japanese culture. It's a manifestation of Japanese culture in one ceremonial act, plus the architecture, which is the tea house. Here's some of the landscape at Katsura. Again, all very human-made. And there are two paths. And here the landscape architect is directing your gaze. So on the right we see a very continuous path. The architect wants you to look up and see something. And then on the left, the architect wants you to look down, which you better, or you got to miss the next stone. And so these stones are separate, and you have to sort of maneuver from stone to stone deliberately to have you look down and appreciate the ground, as opposed to maybe the trees, as is the case on the right. And then some rules for this landscaping. So we see these natural outcrops of rock, but they're not natural. This is all very humanly, deliberately arranged. By rules, we see on the left 3 stone arrangements. The upper one on the left is good, and in every case irregular. On the bottom left is bad. If it's diagonally straight across, up or down, that's bad. It's going to look human-made. It's going to look too regular. On the left, we see it's always irregular, and all the stones are different sizes. So it has this natural look, giving you a communication with interrelationship with nature. Now, let's just look at the influence of this Japanese architecture on modern architecture on the West, and modern art and modern architecture, just very briefly. And of course there's a rich ongoing story of the interrelationship between East and West. There's the Western forcing open of Admiral Perry forcing open Japan. But then there's the continual coming of Eastern ideas to the West, as early as when Alexander the Great goes into India, brings back ideas that become fundamental to Neoplatonism and then Christianity. In the 1700s, the British encounter Sanskrit, and the British and Germans start to be able to get it translated. It starts to influence the philosophies of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's thing in itself is an idea that comes from Eastern thought. But here is Frank Lloyd Wright, who went to Japan when he was quite young and was ongoingly richly influenced by Japan, although he didn't like to admit it. And this is his first what's called prairie-style house. Well, that's for another discussion, but here we have something that we see, this Japanese quality, the asymmetry, the irregularity. Actually, let's jump ahead. And on the left is our asymmetrical plane of Katsura, and a kind of asymmetry in Frank Lloyd Wright, particularly how you move through it. And then we see the framing and the infill in Wright that we had seen in Katsura. Now, this quality that comes into Frank Lloyd Wright then spreads to Europe. So at the bottom is Rietveld Schroeder House. On the bottom left, on the bottom right, is Mies van der Rohe's Brick Country House, and upper right is Mondrian, all of which derive from Frank Lloyd Wright's work, which has this strong Japanese influence. And then here is another example. On the right, we have Walter Gropius's building for the Bauhaus, very famous design school, and see the asymmetry, sort of irregularity of the plan below. Again, very much similar to Katsura. And here on the left again is Katsura seen from the air, nestled into the landscape. On the right is Frank Lloyd Wright's compound in Wisconsin for his home and office, Taliesin East, nestled again into the landscape, sort of on the edge or brow of the hill as we see from below. Again, very much a Japanese feel. And Frank Lloyd Wright's very famous falling water, very much integrated into the landscape, with the waterfall famously going underneath the house. Now, recall we began with this differentiation between, now I have them switched. On the left, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa dominating the landscape, and on the right, human beings and architecture are in that landscape, but we at first hardly notice them because the artist does not make them metaphysically pop. Rather, they are of similar quality of brushstroke, similar quality of attitude to nature, and so we experience them as integral with the landscape. Here, the young woman in Mona Lisa very much pops, dominates the landscape. Now, let's look at more recent European art. So here is the Impressionist painter Monet, and there's very definitely two human beings here, mother and child probably, woman sewing, child with its little book. But look at the quality of the brushstrokes. They do not metaphysically differentiate the figures from the flowers in the background, but treat them very similarly. And here is another Impressionist painter, Pissarro, looking down from his studio at a Parisian streetscape, and there are horse-drawn carriages there, and there are people there, but the people don't pop. They're very of the same quality, of the same metaphysical quality, of the same painterly quality as the trees and the carriages in the building. And so this idea of moving something different from the Renaissance humanism that we've seen in Leonardo, where human beings are now experiencing themselves as once again a part of nature. And finally, Van Gogh wheat fields, and there is a figure there, somebody harvesting wheat, but the quality of how the figure, the human being is painted and everything else is painted is all similar. And now I'm going to end with two quotes. On the left from the Dow Teaching, which is Chinese, not Japanese, but captures the spirit that we've been looking at. And the Dow Teaching is a book that describes the Tao, and the Tao is the way, the principle of all things, and of course very much therefore an issue with nature. And Lao Tzu writes, the Tao begot one, one begot two, two begot three, and three begot the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things are born of being. Being is born of not being. So where does existence come from? How does it come about? How does it manifest itself? And there's this notion of differentiation, but still rooted in being is born of not being, still rooted in an undifferentiated oneness. Louis Kahn, maybe the most important American modern architect after Frank Lloyd Wright, writes, I liken the emergence of light to a manifestation of two brothers, knowing quite well that there are not two brothers, nor even one. A work is made in the urging sound of industry, and when the dust settles, the pyramid, echoing silence, gives the sun its shadow. So here we see in this metaphysical poetry of these two figures a strong similarity between Eastern and Western ideas. Now, if you're interested in this approach to Japan, understanding it kind of symbolically, I'm going to suggest two books. And I'll start with one I'm not suggesting. On the left, Jared Diamond's major bestseller, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And I'm going to be critical of this book in that it looks to material economic explanations for cultures. And of course, a culture can only exist in the material world in which it exists. But I believe that there's an underlying symbolic character to a culture that is of equal importance, if not greater importance, than its material circumstances. And to understand Japanese or Japan in these terms, one might start with two quite old books. The Book of Tea, and describes the tea ceremony, and in so doing describes Japanese culture. And then finally a book written during, but just published just after World War II by Ruth Benedict to study the Japanese, a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, how this culture can be at the one time so martial and technologically competent, and at the same time so spiritual. Thank you.